Hello BookTube, it's Leah Cooper here, and today I'm bringing you a review of Raven Stratagem by Yoon Ha Lee. Now, this is the second book in the Machineries of Empires series. I checked on Goodreads, but I couldn't tell if it was a series or a trilogy. Point is, it's the second book. It is the sequel to Nine Fox Gambit, which came out last year, and which I read earlier this year in preparation for the BookTube SFF Awards. Now, I have a full review of Nine Fox Gambit up, and I will link it up in the cards, so you can go ahead and check that out. And I'm going to try to keep this review as spoiler-free as possible. Raven Stratagem is coming out on June 13th, and when I heard that it was available on NetGalley, I jumped at the chance to try and get an ARC, and I was super excited to be approved for it because I really loved Nine Fox Gambit. And Raven Stratagem was, I've been saying this I think in many videos, but it was my most anticipated release of this year. So for those of you who don't know, the Machineries of Empire series takes place in kind of a future, far-flung, huge, expansive science fiction empire called the Hexarchet, which is composed of 6 factions. Now, they retain their grip over their portion of space using something called exotic technology, which is technology that kind of defies normal physics, and it can do anything from propel a special exotic star drive to turning everyone on a starship into crystals and shattering them. Anything that you can imagine these exotic technologies can produce, and it's all done kind of through math. But to produce them, you have to create an atmosphere that follows a strict mathematical calendar of holidays and timekeeping and all that sort of stuff. And so their entire civilization is kind of wrapped up in this calendrical system and maintaining it so that their technology continues to function. In the first book, we saw our protagonist, Kel Cheris, an infantry captain, be promoted to general. Her government decides to imbue her with the preserved undead consciousness of their greatest general, Shuos Judeo. Now, Judeo is considered a madman because in his day, when he was alive, he was unbeaten in military action, but also ended up killing like thousands of people, and including all of the military officers underneath him. And when that happened, his government chose to remove his consciousness from his body and preserve it in something called the Black Cradle, essentially making him immortal but non-corporeal. And they turned him into a weapon by implanting him selectively into certain people's brains so that they could use his tactical expertise in times of need. So at the beginning of Nine Fox Gambit is one of those times of need. It's considered impregnable. So who do they call on to fight the impossible fight? Shuos Judeo. And a lot of things happen in Nine Fox Gambit, obviously. And Raven Stratagem picks up very soon after the end of Nine Fox Gambit. So I'm hesitant to talk too much about the plot because I don't want to give away any spoilers for the end of Nine Fox Gambit. Suffice it to say, it continues the story, but we get the ongoing conflict between Shuos Judeo and the Hexarchet from very different viewpoints in the second book. So like I said, it picks up at the end of Nine Fox Gambit. Shuos Judeo is still running around kind of causing mischief and mayhem. At the beginning of Raven Stratagem, he seizes control of a military swarm, which is a huge fleet of ships that's usually controlled by a single general, and he decides to start waging war against one of the invading forces that threatens the Hexarchet. And we see this from the point of view of the general of the swarm he takes over, and she kind of becomes his second in command. So we get her interactions with Judeo. We also have a point of view from one of the leaders of the Hexarchet, specifically the leader of the Shuos, who are kind of like the CIA, the spies, the Interpol of this governing body, and another POV from one of the displaced officers from the swarm that Judeo takes over, who vows to take revenge on Judeo for essentially killing the swarm. Now, he hasn't actually killed anyone, but because of the whole thing with heresy and absolute programmed loyalty, anytime that a swarm falls under heretical influence, and obviously Judeo is a very heretical influence, everyone's lives are put into danger. Like either you're going to be disposed of because you can no longer be trusted, or you're going to be reprogrammed by the people who program people in the Empire, or something like that. So it's very different from the first book, in that in the first book we were almost entirely in the perspective of Kelt Cheris, and in the second book, while Judeo is there in forefront in most of the primary events that we see it from very different points of view, which I won't lie, I'm not a huge fan of. I think Cheris was such a great character in the first book that I was disappointed that we didn't get a POV from her again. And I also thought Judeo was a really interesting character in the first book, and because he's in Cheris's mind in the first book, and it's all from her perspective, we get a lot of back and forth conversations with them that were so interesting, and one of the things I just loved about the first book. And so the fact that that didn't exist in the second one, I was a little disappointed, I won't lie. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I love Yoon Ha Lee's writing style. And I think that's one of the things that just, I am immediately sucked in. It's such a beautiful writing style. It not to say that it's like flowery. It's not. It's very straightforward. It's very clear and crisp and matter of fact. I just love it. I find it so engaging. The sort of very quick action pace of the book also is what really draws me in too. One of the criticisms this series has is that it can be difficult to follow. You are, generally speaking, just thrust right into the meat of the story. Lee doesn't spend a whole lot of time on exposition beyond what you need immediately in that moment for that specific scene. But I love that. I hate books with huge blocks of exposition. I would rather just kind of pick things up as I go along, and I feel like the writing style in this really synergizes with the way I like to experience a world. I don't mind being a little bit lost because I'll get there in the end, essentially. Another thing I love is conspiracy and plots, and not always knowing who's lying, who's telling the truth, and where the plot is going. And that is another thing that Lee does exceptionally well. You know, going into these books, going into the second book, that there are going to be layers, that there are going to be people who are dissembling and who are obfuscating the truth. And you know that things may seem one way, but that doesn't mean that that's how they actually are. And you may have multiple reveals where you think you understand what's going on, but then you don't. I just love that. It's so entertaining for me to read that, and I love reading about clever characters. And if there is one person who is extremely clever, it's Judeo. I wasn't a huge fan of the different points of view we get in this, but it was still a 4-star read. So there's my rating. I gave this book a 4-star. I quite enjoyed it. Can I say if it had been from Cheris's point of view, would I have given it 5 stars? I don't know, because it would have been a fundamentally different book. Another criticism I've heard is that in the first book, the secondary characters really didn't get a whole lot of screen time and weren't really developed. I think in the first book, that actually makes sense structurally and thematically, because one of the themes in the first book is the expendability of people. And so to spend any more time on a lot of the secondary characters who do appear on screen, I think would have gutted that theme. And I think we're not supposed to necessarily be super engaged with them, and we are supposed to see them somewhat as chattel to throw in front of a bullet. That is a principle in the first book. The fact that in Raven Stratagem we get several new characters and they get a lot of screen time, and we get time in their heads to see how they view Judeo, how they view the Hexerchet, how they view the Hafen, who are the invaders, all that sort of stuff, I think might appeal to those people who thought that the secondary characters weren't developed enough in the first one. As far as understandability, if you want to call it that, if you've read the first book and you enjoyed it, the second book shouldn't be too hard to understand. You're still dealing with the same principles that were introduced in the first book. If you haven't read Nine Fox Gambit, don't start with Raven Stratagem. You will be utterly confused. They're not standalones at all. And in that same regard, the ending was definitely a cliffhanger. There was a lot about this book that felt like the protagonist setting up pieces for the next book. Like I said in my 9 Fox Gambit review, I highly suggest this series if you like Ender's Game but you don't want to read Orson Scott Card. I think it has a lot of similar feels and has a great hard science fiction sense to it, but it's not written by an asshole. So if you like a really smart female protagonist, definitely pick up 9 Fox Gambit. Cheris is just one of the best characters I've read. Overall, I continue to really love this series, and I'm really excited to read the next one. I mean, I'm saying that before the second one has even been published, so I feel a little bit bad going all, so what's the third one going to be called? You know? I've had the book kicking around in my head all weekend as I've been trying to think about, like, okay, what do I want to say? But it's so hard to do a review for a second book, you know what I'm saying? Point is, I love this series. On average, I've given the series 4.5 stars. I really love it. And I guess I'm going to cut myself off there because I could just, you know, keep repeating, it's great, forever. Thank you to Solaris Publishing for approving my ARC request. I hope this has inspired you to check out this series. Let me know in the comments down below if it has, or if you've read the first book or the second book. I'd love to hear what you thought of it. And I'll catch you guys all in my next video. Bye.